Welcome to the Dystonia information session with Dr. Robert Chen. My name is Stephanie Ince. I'm the Executive Director of the Dystonia Medical Research Foundation Canada, and we're so happy to have all of you here. Some of you are new faces, some of you are familiar, but we're thrilled to have you, and I'm glad we can all be together here this afternoon. I want to thank Dr. Chen for being here. Many of you may know Dr. Chen. He's a great friend to the Dystonia community and an amazing advocate and friend to the foundation. I'll give you guys just a very brief bio of the sort of level of expertise that you're about to hear from. So Dr. Chen received his MA and medical degrees from the University of Cambridge and a Master of Science from the University of Toronto. He undertook an internship at Guy's Hospital at the University of London, and internal medicine residency at Queen's University, a neurology residency at the University of Western, a fellowship at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke at NIH. He's currently the senior scientist at the Cervical Research Institute, the professor of medicine for neurology at the University of Toronto, the Catherine Manson Chair in Movement Disorders, and the director of the Elliott Phillipson Clinical Scientist Training Program. Dr. Chen's research interests are human motor control and physiology, human brain plasticity, and pathophysiology of movement disorders such as dystonia and Parkinson's disease. He has authored over 270 peer-reviewed research papers and 2 books, and mentored many graduates and postdoctoral fellows. He's currently the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Journal of Neurological Sciences. He's a member of the editorial boards of Neurology, Muscle and Nerve, and a reviewing editor of PLOS One. He holds research funding from Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Parkinson's Canada, the Dystonia Coalition, and DMRF, as well as the Weston Brain Institute.
What I try to do today is to give you just an introduction, overview of what is dystonia, what is the manifestation of dystonia, what we know about the causes and treatment, and then at the end a little bit about the research. So this will be a general overview. What is dystonia? So this is the current, if you like, the medical definition of dystonia. So there was a previous definition. This is the one that's updated in 2013. So dystonia is, we call it a syndrome. So what does mean a syndrome? Which means that it's not a single disease. So there are many diseases or many problems that can cause dystonia. So that's why it is called a syndrome. So, and this is characterized by mainly sustained or intermittent muscle contraction. So in a sense, there's too much muscle contraction. And that often will cause abnormal or repetitive movement or abnormal postures, or both. And the dystonia movement is, we call typically patterned, I think many of us call twisting, so-called the twisted postures, and can have a tremulous component, which could be like shaking or tremor type, but it's not always. And typically, we often see people with dystonia. It is often worsened or initiated by when you person try to do something, a voluntary action, typical worsened dystonia, and it is so we call overflow of muscle activation, which means that when you try to do something, you need to activate certain muscles. Overflow means that some other muscle that are not necessary to do the task is also activated. So when we assess someone with dystonia, there are a number of things we want to know, say if someone has dystonia. So first, in this diagnostic category, there are we call two axes. The axis first one is what is the clinical characteristic of someone with dystonia. So there are a number of characteristics we want to know. So the first is age of onset. So I listed here, I hope you can see the screen, a number of range of age of onset. The age of onset is important because the cause of dystonia is different depending on when is the age of onset. For example, in someone infancy, from birth to 2 years, often it is because of, for example, birth defect, a birth injury, or it could be from metabolic disorders. And some with onset in childhood or adolescence often could be because of genetic causes. but then genetic cause is less common in someone who has dystonia starting on adulthood. And then the late adult, often we look at, we explain later what we call secondary causes. So important in both in terms of the causes and also the overall manifestation dystonia. And then the second, or the next point we want to know is what is the distribution of dystonia, which body part is affected. So in some people with dystonia, we call it focal. Focal means only one body part, for example, only the hand. Could be segmental, for example, the whole arm or the neck, so that's called segmental. And in some people, it's multifocal, for example, could be both hands and the feet, for example. And there is generalized, which basically means the whole body is affected. And there is also, we call hemidystonia. Hemi means half the body is affected, say the right side or the left side. This is important because the causes of dystonia is different depending on whether it's one part of the body or it's generalized. And also the treatment is different. Okay. And the other characteristics we want to know is what is we call the temporal pattern, which is the time course. So in some situations, the dystonia is static, so it's basically remain the same. Okay. In some cases, it's progressive, so it could get worse over time. So in addition to this longer time course, so there is also a shorter variation. So some people, it is basically constant, more or less constant all the time. In some people, we call action specific. So only happen when the person do a certain type of activity. For example, I'll show you example, like, for example, writing. And in some people, it has a diurnal, which means day and night. So the daytime could be different from night. So the daytime simply could worse than night, nighttime worse than the day. And in some cases, we call paroxysm. Paroxysm means that it only happens suddenly at some time. So sometimes person no dystonia and suddenly dystonia happens and then it goes away. Okay, so these are also different patterns that people can have. Okay. And then the other characteristic we want to know is it only dystonia, or is there some other problems? For example, some people can have Parkinson's disease and dystonia, so that person would have both features that we see in people with Parkinson's disease, plus dystonia. But many people with only dystonia. So in the current terminology, people with only dystonia we call isolated dystonia, and people with other problems we called combined dystonia. And similarly, so we want to look for, is there other problems, neurological or other manifestations that in addition to the dystonia. Again, this is because the cause of dystonia is different depending on whether it's only dystonia or there's some other issues as well. Okay. And then so this is the first axis, is what is the characteristic of the dystonia. Okay. And then the second we want to know or try to assess is etiology, which means what is the cause of this dystonia. So one is that, is there any problem, any pathology in the brain? So in some cases, now in most people with just dystonia, we often found no degeneration in the brain. Okay, so you do a brain imaging, MRI study, usually it's normal. But sometimes the evidence of degeneration, for example I showed earlier is, for example, someone with Parkinson's disease, there is degenerate in the brain. So people can have dystonia as well. And sometimes there are some structural lesions. For example, someone could have a stroke. And sometimes a stroke, after years later, could cause a dystonia. Then that would show up as we call it a structural lesion. But often there's no evidence of degeneration or structural lesion in the brain. So other aspect you want to know about the cause of dystonia is that, is this inherited? Is there a genetic cause of dystonia? And if it's not inherited, is there other causes? So I listed some possible cause. So perinatal brain injury can cause a type of dystonia. Certain people's brain infection, we call encephalitis. Sometimes it could be effects of drugs. Sometimes it could be effects of stroke. Neoplastic is like, for example, they have a brain tumor or effects of a head injury. So these are also possible causes of dystonia. And then idiopathic means we don't know what caused it. Sporadic means that there's no family history. So person has dystonia, but none of any known family member has dystonia. But sometimes it's familial, so that the person has family members that has dystonia. After that, in that case, then the chances that there's genetic cause is much higher. Okay. So, what I've gone through so far is what we try to assess when we see someone dystonia. So first is what is the clinical manifestation of dystonia, and try to assess what's the cause of dystonia. So what I like to go through next is to show you some examples of different types of dystonia. Okay. So the first type of dystonia is a genetic primary dystonia. The most common type of this type is we call DYT1. So DYT stands for dystonia. One is the naming of the genes that cause dystonia. So it's the first gene that's discovered. That's why it's called DYT1. Okay. So DYT1 is the commonest cause of early onset dystonia. And the average onset is about age 12, but typically onset before age 30. And typically the onset is in the limbs, either in the arms or the leg, and then the dystonia becomes generalized. So when we see somebody with a generalized dystonia, what do we do? So first we might want to do some tests to find out what causes dystonia. So we often will do genetic testing, particularly people with onset age 26. The reason being that the likelihood of finding a genetic cause is much higher with a younger onset dystonia. And we may want to do tests to exclude other causes. So this is the disease called Wilson's disease, which is a disease of abnormal copper accumulation or metabolism. The reason we want to do this is because these are treatable. Okay, so there are medication drugs to treat these. So we want to exclude Wilson's disease, and depending on the situation, we want to do other tests to exclude other disorders. For example, a very young person, like maybe 2 or 3 year old, want to exclude like metabolic disorders, for example. There's also an entity we call dopa responsive dystonia. So sometimes, often people will give a trial of a medication called levodopa, which is the medication commonly used to treat people with Parkinson's disease. But it's uncommonly, so the rare type of dystonia is responsive to levodopa. Again, we want to at least exclude it because these are easily treatable. Okay. And also we want to look for other causes of dystonia. So I mentioned some of these already. So a head trauma, brain infection, drugs, or stroke, for example. And we want to see if there are other abnormalities other than dystonia. For example, it's a seizure that would point to other problems. Hemidystonia is, I mentioned, is affecting one side, just the right side or the left side. If that's the case, then it's actually quite a strong indication that there is likely to be something in the brain that caused that. People with rest dystonia at the onset, so rest means dystonia happened at rest without any action. This is also more likely to have some other causes. And onset in the late and adulthood, because there are certain diseases, for example, Parkinson's disease, can begin with dystonia in the legs. And obviously people with abnormal brain imaging study, may talk about MRI studies that indicate that there could be something, a lesion in the brain that could be causing the dystonia. So that'll go to what is the treatment of someone with a generalized dystonia. So there are a number of possible treatments. So first, there is certain type of medications. I'm not going to go through all these medications, but in general, there's a class of drugs we call anticholinergics. The common one is called trihexyphenidyl or Artane. There is other medication called clonazepam, one called baclofen, the other called tetrabenazine. So these are all medications that we often would use for people with generalized dystonia. Now all these medications could have side effects. Often it's drowsiness, some other side effects as well. Then the other treatment is surgery. So the surgery currently do is there's a surgery called pallidotomy, which is putting a lesion or just burning a hole in part of the brain. But the most common surgery we do currently is called deep brain stimulation. So I think next I'll explain a bit of deep brain stimulation. So the typical target is an area deep in the brain. The name is called internal globus pallidus. Botulinum toxin injection can also be used, but in general dystonia we cannot inject everywhere. But in some cases that certain part of the body is most affected, then that part could be treated with botulinum toxin injection. Okay. So this is a illustration of deep brain stimulation. So the deep brain stimulation, an electrode is put in what we call the deep part of the brain, called the basal ganglia. That's why I call deep brain stimulation. And then it is connected through a lead, wire lead, and then usually it's a battery pack placed on the chest wall. We call it a pulse generator. And it is similar to, if you know people with a cardiac pacemaker, basically a very similar device, except obviously that the wire is connected to deep inside the brain and not to the heart, as in the case of the cardiac pacemaker. Okay, so now I'm going to move from the generalized dystonia to talk about certain forms of focal or segmental dystonia. So the first, probably the more common type is we call cervical dystonia. Or we also call spasmodic torticollis. So this is dystonia mainly affecting the neck muscles. Okay. So cervical dystonia is a movement disorder with involuntary contraction of the neck and shoulder muscles, and often causing the head to twist into abnormal postures. And pain is quite common in people with cervical dystonia. The pain is actually not common in other types of, for example, arm dystonia, leg dystonia. Often not a common feature, but in cervical dystonia is quite a common feature. So apart from pain and the posturing, people with cervical dystonia often have difficulty, for example, reading, driving, watching television, and sometimes could result in maybe withdrawal from social interactions. So there are different types of head positioning in people with cervical dystonia. So some called torticollis here is the neck is turned to one side. Often it could be the left side or right side. Lateral collis is tilted to one side. And rectal collis is the head is rotated backwards. And anterior collis is forward. Okay, so, but many people will have a combination of these. For example, someone can have a turn to one side, a tilt to one side, and also backward at the same time. So how do we see someone with cervical dystonia, what do we evaluate? So now the majority of people with cervical dystonia is called idiopathic. So there's no obvious cause that can be found. Okay, but we often will take a careful drug history, because certain drugs could cause or at least predispose to cervical dystonia. And then investigation. So I think it's probably not necessary in every single person with cervical dystonia, but depending on the situation, now these investigations mainly to exclude other causes of cervical dystonia. Okay, so these cannot diagnose cervical dystonia. So we might do a brain MRI to look for is there something like a stroke, for example, that could cause it. Sometimes when you want to do a neck, cervical spine, the arm of the neck, to look for anything in the spine or the spinal cord that could mimic the dystonia. And sometimes we could screen for, we call Wilson's again disease, the copper metabolism. Sometimes we do the EMG is electrophysiological testing if we suspect there's a nerve and muscle abnormality. And if we suspect or there's a positive family history, we might consider genetic testing. Okay. So I talk about brain MRI. So the brain MRI, the main lesion we look for is a location deep in the brain. It's called the basal ganglia. So someone with a lesion in the basal ganglia, most common is a stroke. Dystonia is the most frequent manifestation. And among the basal ganglia, there's a particular area in because the name called putamen is the most likely area that a lesion can cause dystonia. So what's the treatment of cervical dystonia? So the treatment is basically similar to the general dystonia, but the order is different. Okay, so we usually consider the first line treatment is botulinum toxin injection. Okay, so it's been shown in large randomized trials that this is effective. So generally effective for both the posture and the pain component. Side effects of botulinum toxin injection sometimes could include some dysphagia with some difficulty in swallowing, pain, and can produce muscle weakness. So botulinum toxin works primarily by reducing muscle spasm, but it can also cause weakness if it's, the doses is too high. Okay. We can sometimes also use medication, so basically the same medication listed before for the generalized dystonia. And some people use both medication and botulinum toxin injection. So I showed you some videos already of surgery, which is mainly deep brain stimulation treatment. Now, deep brain stimulation would not be the first line for cervical dystonia, usually reserved for people who do not respond to the previous treatments. Okay. The other procedure that has been done is we call peripheral denervation. So it is basically cut some of the nerve that goes to the neck muscles. It is now very rarely done now. Very few surgeons actually still do this type of operation. Okay. So this is just the example of some of the muscles that are frequently injected using botulinum toxin injection. Okay. Go through this. Okay. So next type of the dystonia I like to show is called blepharospasm. So blepharospasm is involuntary spasm of the muscles of the eye. So it often causes involuntary eye closure, and in severe cases, the person can be functionally blind. Okay. For blepharospasm, so the first line is treatment is botulinum toxin injection. I think most people actually works quite well. And then the second line is the same, the medications. Often people with blepharospasm are sensitive to light, and so many of them wear dark glasses, particularly when you go outside. Some people, for example, fluorescent light is some people found it bothersome. Okay. So then the third type of focal or segment dystonia I like to talk about is limb dystonia. Okay, so affecting the arm. So the types of dystonia that sometimes we see is we call focal hand dystonia. So one type is called writer's cramp. So writer's cramp is usually insidious onset of dystonia, and the person will report tightness or discomfort when they perform certain activity. And it's often task specific. So writer's cramp is often specific to writing, but sometimes it may progress to affect other activities as well. And it may remain focal, which means only affects the hand, for example. So usually people who remain focal, but sometimes it can affect not just the hand, but all more proximal muscle, for example, the shoulder or elbow muscles, and may affect the other side. So what happens, some people writer's cramp is that because they have trouble writing, say someone right hand with right hand, some may try to write with left hand. Some people are successful, they can then write with left hand, but in some situations, then the left hand, after a number of years, also become affected with the writer's cramp. So again, writer's cramp is because of abnormal muscle contraction leading to abnormal posture. As mentioned, is often we call task specific. So in this example here, we can see the picture. So this person holding the pen, and he has this involuntary extension of the thumb and the index finger. So when he tries to write. So just this is an example of again someone with writer's cramp trying to write. So what he's reporting is that he has to hold the pen tight, and then the finger, what he calls, flops around. So his main problem is with the index finger. Yeah. So the way sometimes how do we assess this is, so we ask the person now to write with his left hand. You see he's writing with left hand. And then we observe what happened with the right hand. So when he writes with the left hand, you can see that there is what we call extension of the wrist and also movement of the finger. So we're more certain that this is the problem when he's writing with the right hand. Okay. You can see there's this movement in the right hand as he writes with the left hand. Okay. Then the other type of focal dystonia we often see is we call musician's dystonia. So this obviously affects musicians and is estimated to affect at least 1 in 200 professional musicians, and is probably more common than that. And what we see is it can affect any type of musical instrument, piano players, drummer, guitar, or any type of musical instrument. And there are many studies done. So we think that this is related to a mixture of genetic and environmental factors that could affect the dystonia. So this is a sample of someone we see who is a guitarist. He's actually a professional guitarist. He plays in a professional band, and he's affecting his fingers. So basically, he had trouble holding the pick with his right hand. Actually, I'm going to skip over. Actually, there's a music, but you can't hear it from where you are. Yeah. Okay. So what is the treatment of this type of dystonia, writer's cramp and musician's cramp? So again, for the treatment, the first line is usually botulinum toxin injection. Medication is the second line. It's a similar medication I mentioned earlier. But we often also use or sometimes use rehabilitation training. There are some certain types described in the medical literature. Sensory training, something called sensory motor retuning. There is something called a writing device. So basically what the writing device do is that you can put a pen on the device. What it does is that when you write, it basically forces you to use the more proximal muscles instead of the hand muscles to write. Surgery for these conditions are not really been defined. They're very rare cases that, for usually a number of reports from Japan, for example, that people have done surgery for people with musician's dystonia, but that we have rarely done that. Okay, so for the last part of the talk, I like to do is to highlight or show some of the research that being done in dystonia. This is a very big topic, so I'm going to be very selective in terms of what type of research I'm going to show, because this is a wide area. So we'll be somewhat biased. So one is very active is genetics of dystonia. So I mentioned that the genes in the DYT1 is the first gene that has been identified. Now there are at least 28 genes, so the number from 1 to 28 that has been identified to cause dystonia. Now, but it is not only these DYT1 genes. There are also a number of other genes that is not called DYT1 can also cause dystonia. The reason is that with the advances in genetics, we now recognize that someone with the same gene, even the same family, can have different manifestations. So someone can carry the gene, can have dystonia, another person have something else. Maybe have like Parkinson features or have seizures, for example. So, and also some with a similar clinical manifestation of dystonia, say generalized dystonia, can be caused by different genes. Okay, so some of the many new research is on finding new genes. So we now 1 to 28, but new genes are being found all the time. So next year, I'm sure it will be more. Okay. And then once we found the gene, what do we do? So people want to know what's the function of these genes, and often people would do is to look for when there's something wrong in the gene, what's wrong in the cell. So we have to build cell models for dystonia, and people have used animal models. So you can put this defective gene in the animal using the mouse and see what happened to the mouse, for example. So to see what these genes are doing, why do abnormality in the gene would cause dystonia. And the reason why we're doing all this is hope that if we know, then we can look for new treatment. So maybe look for new drugs. We know which pathway these proteins or these genes is working on, and which abnormal, then it's easier to identify, look for drugs. There are different antibodies or even different brain stimulation treatment for dystonia. Now, some of the research, this is more related to what I've been doing, is to understand what's wrong in the brain in people with dystonia, and for example, how does deep brain stimulation work? I'll show you some videos of people with deep brain stimulation. I mean, it works in many cases. I have to say, not every case. Okay, so not every case works, but in many cases it works. But we actually don't know how it works or why it works. Okay, so I mentioned in dystonia, typically in many people with dystonia, there's no obvious structural lesion. So we do an MRI scan of the brain, it's often normal. And there's no neurodegeneration. For example, there's neurodegeneration in other diseases like Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, there's death of cells in the brain. But often dystonia, there isn't. So we think that dystonia is because of we call abnormal brain plasticity. So what's brain plasticity? Brain plasticity is the ability of the brain to change. For example, if you do learning new skills, memory involves changing the brain connections, brain cells. But we think that in dystonia, it could be this change become abnormal. And often there is abnormal connections between different brain areas that leads to dystonia. As I mentioned, how deep brain stimulation works is not entirely known. And we think that plasticities is particularly involved in dystonia because I show you the deep brain stimulation, but typically in deep brain stimulation in dystonia, it doesn't work right away. It takes weeks to months to work, which is different from people with, say, tremor or Parkinson's disease. Those work immediately. Okay, so which suggests is that this treatment is causing some changes in the brain on the long term for it to work. So it's involved, we call it the brain plasticity. Okay. So I just show you some of the studies that we do. So some of the studies we use in our own lab is we use something called magnetic brain stimulation. So you may have heard of it. So magnetic brain stimulation is we just put a coil on top of the head and use a magnetic wave to stimulate the brain. So some of the research we're doing is, so this is the brain. The lower part here is where the deep brain stimulation is implanted. So it's implanted deep part of the brain, but we can at the same time put a coil on the head. So some of the research we do is to have someone with deep brain stimulation, and at the same time we use a magnetic coil over the head to stimulate the brain. Basically, our purpose here is to mainly to figure out how deep brain stimulation works. Okay. So the study that I'm just going to briefly show you is that we have people with dystonia who has deep brain stimulation of the internal globus pallidus, and we use two methods. So what we did is we use EEG. Some of you know EEG basic is brain wave recording, so electrical brain waves. So just put electrodes on the surface of the head to record the electrical brain wave. And then the second one is this thing called magnetic stimulation. So put a coil in the subject's head to stimulate the brain underneath. Okay. So this is what we found. So this is the results with brain wave recording, EEG. So this is what we found on the top of the head. So we found that so it's someone who had dystonia, and we use the DBS. So we want to know is when the deep brain stimulation is working, what's happened to the brain waves in the head. So we actually found there is a distinct area. So probably the detail doesn't matter at very short time, just 10 milliseconds. So 1 millisecond is 1,000th of a second. So 10 millisecond is 100th of a second. Then it activates, we call negative area, one part of the brain, and then a positive area. So we know what we found is that the deep part of the brain activates the surface of the brain as very exquisite timing. And the other thing we do is if we pair these stimulation, pair the deep brain stimulation with the surface brain stimulation and repeated it over time, what we found is at a certain time, so if we paired it at 10 milliseconds or about 25 milliseconds, we found that we can change the brain. We can change the brain, become more excitable. So we can measure the excitability of the brain by stimulating the brain and measure the output. So what we find is that if you pair the deep brain stimulation with the surface brain stimulation, this is for about half an hour, then we can make the brain more excitable. So we think that there is an interaction between the deep brain stimulation and the surface brain stimulation. So actually just some examples. So another example of a study that we're actually currently doing is we think that in the brain, the back part of the brain is called the cerebellum. So this is a picture. So this mark with an X here. So it's the back part called the cerebellum. So currently there is a lot of interest in the cerebellum in dystonia. In the last 5 or 6 years, there are a lot of studies suggesting the cerebellum plays an important role in mediating dystonia. So in this study, we actually put a magnetic coil in the back of the brain to stimulate the cerebellum. And we want to see is how that changes the connection of the cerebellum. So this is cerebellum to the rest of the brain. And we found that it did actually suppress the connection of the cerebellum to the rest of the brain. So what we're currently doing is, this is in normal subjects. So we extend the study to people with dystonia. So because we think that in dystonia, there is an abnormal connection between the cerebellum and the rest of the brain. So we want to see is if this type of stimulation can normalize the abnormal connection. So this is one step towards to see if this could be a viable treatment. But this is the first step. Just want to see if this stimulation in the back of the brain called the cerebellum can normalize connections with the rest of the brain in people with dystonia. So, so I mentioned earlier some of the studies show the deep part of the brain connects to the surface of the brain at specific times, and we can induce brain plasticity by pairing the deep brain stimulation with a surface magnetic brain stimulation. And stimulation of deep part of the brain can change the connections of different brain areas. Okay. So what are the ongoing research? So as I mentioned, some of my own lab, we are looking at a few studies. So we're looking at first effects of botulinum toxin on brain plasticity. We think that botulinum toxin works, partly obvious because it relaxes the muscle, but we think that there is also an effect on the brain plasticity. It changes the brain itself. And we are doing studies examining the effects of the cerebellar stimulation on the brain connections I showed you earlier. That we think that the cerebral stimulation could normalize the abnormal connections in the brain in people with dystonia. But then obviously there are other works being done. I mentioned earlier, so there are lots of works on genetics and on the molecular pathway, so the genes and the molecules that are found with the genetic abnormalities. A lot of work to understand how this molecule works and what's wrong when there's a genetic mutation that causes dystonia. And many people, again, work on animal models of dystonia. Some people use a mouse model. There are actually other called C. elegans models. And there are lots of also studies on brain imaging. Brain imaging include MRI scan. There are also people we call the PET scan, which is using a specific neurochemical receptors. And there are also other studies we can looking at epidemiology, so looking at database. For example, still a lot of studies need to be done on, we don't have a very good idea how many people has dystonia, because we know that dystonia is underdiagnosed. So just by people who know dystonia is not a good measure. So a lot of looking at database and also other work looking at biobanking. So what biobanking means is that some of the blood samples sometimes even use cerebrospinal fluid, which needs a lumbar puncture to get it, because think that there are these markers in the blood or other samples that could either help to diagnose dystonia or help to predict the disease cause of dystonia, and eventually possible to predict who would respond to which type of treatment. Okay, so I think that's more or less all I have to say. So I just want to thank you. So I work at the Toronto Western Movement Disorder Center. So some of you may see these are a number of other neurologists that works there. And also I mentioned some of the work we did in our lab. So these are some of the people who works in our lab. Just want to acknowledge them. Okay, so again, well, thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions from you. Yeah. So maybe I'll just repeat the question. Okay, so because the new valbenazine is a new drug approved by the FDA for tardive dyskinesia. So we know tardive dyskinesia is a abnormal movement caused by a group of drugs we call neuroleptics. Okay, so sometimes there's also we call tardive dystonia. So people who has these abnormal can also get dystonia. So which is why we actually take a good drug history when we see someone with dystonia. So, but the question is, does this drug works? This drug is very similar to a drug we call tetrabenazine. The drug is approved by the FDA in the US. It's not approved in Canada. Yeah, so we cannot prescribe it in Canada. But from what we know is that it is very similar to a drug we call tetrabenazine. The advantage of this drug is that it may have less side effects. Because it's not approved in Canada, I don't have any direct experience with this drug. But from what we know is that the tetrabenazine, it works in some cases of dystonia, particularly dystonia caused by neuroleptics, which is dystonia, which is called tardive dystonia, which is dystonia from long-term side effect of the neuroleptic drug. So it might work with those tardive dystonia. It sometimes works in other type of dystonia, but I would say not often. But to our knowledge, is that this new drug, it seemed to be, the way it works seems to be similar to the tetrabenazine, but it may have less side effects. So it could be useful in some sense because the tetrabenazine, of the limiting factors is the side effects of the drug. Yeah. But unfortunately, the drug is not yet available in Canada at this point. Yeah. Is with hand dystonia, right? So, I think Jennifer mentioned that her neurologist said that there is no gene for hand dystonia. Is that right? Yeah.
I know it doesn't run in my family. I just wanted to factor it out.
Yeah.
Because
right.
everyone says it could be a possibility.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the answer is that I think it's both. So there is no gene that is known to cause only hand dystonia, but there are familial cases being identified. But the thing is that we now know that even you have a gene for dystonia, there's a typical manifestation of it, but there are atypical manifestations. So, for example, someone with we call the DYT1 dystonia, which is usually dystonia affecting the whole body, can sometimes manifest only as cervical dystonia. But also, so some of these genes, it's possible that it could only manifest as a hand dystonia, although the gene is not a hand dystonia gene, so to speak, because it often could, another person who has that genetic abnormality could manifest some other ways. So I think so the answer I think is that I think it's possible that it is genetic. But again, have to depend on the situation and what the other family members how they are affected. So I would not rule out a genetic.
But your brains became deformed.
Right. Yeah. So of course, yeah. So often we think now, for people with hand dystonia, we think that there is a mixture often of genetic predisposition and some environmental factors. And the environmental factors is often repetitive motion or as abnormal patterns. Why we think that abnormal brain plasticity is involved in dystonia. Having said that, but I mean, I think we think there's often, so the genetic causes are different. So sometimes there is a gene that we think causes dystonia, but on the other hand, we think that there are many cases there is we call genetic predisposition, which means that whatever is often not by a single gene, often by a number of genes together, but it makes you more likely to get it than somebody else doesn't have it. Okay, so unfortunately, it's really very difficult to test for genetic predisposition because often we don't know all the genes that cause it. For example, say someone who normally have, say, 1 in 1,000 chance of getting something. You have a genetic predisposition, your risk could be 1 in 50, but it's still quite low, right? But it's quite different from 1 in 1,000, for example. So this is what we call genetic predisposition, right? So it by itself it doesn't cause it because, say, you have this, you only have 1 in 50 chance. So unfortunately, there's no real way of testing for genetic predisposition because but there are gene panels that can be tested. We think that the gene will at least a very high chance of causing dystonia. So, but I guess to the original question, I would say that someone with just a hand dystonia, I would not by that exclude a genetic cause. I think again, depending on age onset, manifestation, or how the other family member is affected to decide whether somebody want to have genetic testing or not.
But in your slide, you had mentioned that it's possible that there's no family history at all.
Yes. So it's possible family, but usually then we would test someone who has a younger age of onset. Then the chances are much higher. So in the teenagers or in childhood onset, or someone with a generalized dystonia. Yeah. So I mean, it's not impossible, but I think we just look for situations that we think is more likely. Right? So more likely younger age of onset, and also people with a generalized dystonia rather than a focal dystonia.
Okay, what's the difference between focal and multifocal?
Okay, so focal is the question is different focal and multifocal. Focal is, say, just one hand, so is right hand.
Yeah.
So if there's 2 hands, then it's become multifocal.
So why was I diagnosed focal if I'm multifocal?
Well, I'm not sure the focal is different from, in the sense, what we think about it, because even with someone with focal hand dystonia, for example, we can do some studies to look at So some research study look at how the brain is often is the abnormality is not limited to the hand that's manifesting the dystonia. So there are other abnormalities often in people who only have the right hand aesthetic, for example. When we test them, do some research testing, we can find abnormalities on the left hand. But the left hand is fine. There's no dystonia. So we think that some of there is a, if you like, is a underlying factor that at least says that these abnormalities is predisposing or make the dystonia more likely, but it's not by itself sufficient to cause dystonia. So I think at the, so the term focal and multifocal is really mainly on the manifestation of dystonia. It's just one side or different sites. Right? Yeah. So dystonia, yes, so can cause pain. Often is in part because of muscle spasm. So I mentioned that the commonest we see pain is in cervical dystonia. In people with limb dystonia, we can see pain, but I would say usually it's not as prominent. But having said that, I mean, there is a wide range of manifestation of dystonia. So certainly pain is part of it. It's just more common in people with neck dystonia than other regions, but not to say that one cannot have pain, because often pain, at least in part, is because of excessive muscle spasm that can cause pain. So, but I think you also have to, there sometimes secondary causes. For example, if there's a lot of movement, you can cause predisposed, for example, someone to arthritis, for example. So they're often not only the dystonia itself can cause pain. Sometimes there are secondary complication, if you like, can also be manifest as pain. The first question is clarify the mechanism of, I think, what we call the sensory trick. Okay, so some of the literature called Jess antagonistic. So what? That's a very good question. So what is the sensory trick? Is that it can happen a number of, so with cervical dystonia, can have blepharospasm, spasm, occasionally in some people with focal hand dystonia. What it is that often the person will say someone with neck dystonia, touch certain part of the neck or the chin or the face, and by the act of touching, it will help the dystonia. And it's often not by just pushing. Okay, so the question, what's the mechanism, right? Yeah, that's a very good question, because we actually don't fully understand the mechanism. Some of the actual studies we do is try to understand this mechanism. But the background of this is that we think that dystonia is not only a motor disorder. Obviously, a motor disorder because there's movement problem. We think that there's also sensory problem in people with dystonia. Okay, so we think that this is related to how the brain process sensory information. Okay, so the interesting is that often some people with this trick, usually they have to do it themselves. If somebody touch it, doesn't work. Okay, and sometimes the movement, even the act of touching, even before reaching, say the skin, the dystonia starts to get better. Okay, so we actually don't. There is still very active research of exactly how it works, but we think that it is a input, a motor act that the person is doing, plus a sensory input, and we think that there's abnormal, we call sensory motor integration. So because you often have sensory signal coming in, sensation, skin, vision, and you transform it into a movement, motor act. So you have to integrate sensory and motor information. There's something, there is a abnormality in people with dystonia, and what this does is that it helps with, we think, the sensory motor integration part. So this is roughly think how it works, but actually still a lot of work being done of how it works. Right? Sorry, I forgot the second question. Yeah.
Is it the research going towards a cure?
Yes. Right. So okay. So the research Is it going? I would say that the long-term goal of the research is a cure or at least a better treatment. Okay, sometimes treatment is not necessarily a cure. For example, botulinum toxin injection is not a cure. Deep brain stimulation is not a cure, but it still works. I mean, it still benefits people with dystonia. So, for example, the research we're doing, say, using the magnetic brain stimulation, I would say that even works is probably not a cure, but at least provide a useful treatment. But having said that, I think most research, at least over the long term, is to either have a cure or at least provide a new treatment. Now, having said that, the goal of the research in the short term might not be that, okay? Because you need to do a lot of things first to figure it out before you can do a study to see if it works in people. For example, that's why people have animal models. You need to understand how it works, and you have a treatment. You can treat the animal first, see if it works, before you go to human, for example. And also the study, the brain stimulation study we're currently doing, we want to know is the treatment we do, does it normalize the connection in the brain first? So if it works, then we can do another study to see if it actually help people in terms of the dystonia. So again, the research often come with small steps. So the step that is currently doing may not be aimed to get a treatment or a cure, but obviously the overall, the long-term goal is eventually to get to that. Yeah. Okay. So the question is there any MRI result that would rule out having DBS, right? Yeah. Yes, I guess yes and no. So because there are most people have we call primary dystonia or isolated dystonia, which have a normal MRI. Okay, but sometimes people have we call secondary dystonia, which is dystonia secondary to something in the brain, often a stroke or could be a tumor or something that could cause dystonia. For DBS, in general, we think that the results are better in people with an isolated dystonia, which means people have a normal brain MRI. Okay, so that's the result so far. Having said that, people with secondary dystonia have something in the brain that we think causes dystonia can also, it's not impossible, I mean, can also have a beneficial effect. But from what we know so far, the chances are better in people who have normal brain MRI. Okay, so have abnormal brain MRI again depends on what is the abnormality, because sometimes there are abnormality we think have nothing to do with dystonia, because the people with, for example, stroke some other area we don't think is related to dystonia. But people with something in the brain that we think causes dystonia, I think is not excluded from DBS, I would say, but it has to be considered in the light of the fact that the chance of benefit would be probably lower than someone without the normal brain MRI. Yeah. So the MRI we want to do in people with dystonia anyway is to look for any abnormal that could explain the dystonia. Okay, so most people is normal. I mean, but there's a certain lesion in a certain region of the brain we think can cause dystonia. But so you have dystonia already. MRI is normal, let's say, but if dystonia doesn't change, then there's probably no point in doing another MRI. Now, I think you mentioned Parkinson's disease. So MRI cannot diagnose Parkinson's disease. Okay, so in Parkinson's, MRI is normal. Okay, and same as dystonia. So these are clinical diagnoses. So MRI is more to exclude other things. For example, a tumor or stroke, demyelination like multiple sclerosis. For those things can be diagnosed with MRI, but you cannot diagnose dystonia or Parkinson with MRI. You can use MRI to look for what causes dystonia, but the MRI cannot diagnose things like dystonia or Parkinson's. Okay. Yeah. So the question is, what happened to neurotransmitter in the brain in dystonia, right? Yeah. So again, that depends on, because dystonia is a syndrome. There are many causes of dystonia. So there is a dystonia we call dopa-responsive dystonia. It's a very uncommon, but it responds very well to dopamine drugs, to levodopa, which is used to treat people with Parkinson's disease. So in that particular condition, there is a deficiency in the neurotransmitter called dopamine, because we know, because there is actually inherited enzyme abnormality that the person did not produce enough dopamine. So that's why you replace it with a medication, it works quite well. So in that situation, there's clearly an abnormality in deficiency in neurotransmitter dopamine in the brain. But other than that, there are other studies to suggest that in other people with, say, a isolated form of dystonia, there could be some abnormal dopamine abnormality. But they are much more subtle than people with, say, the dopa-responsive dystonia that I mentioned earlier. But in most people, when we treat people with dopamine, levodopa, it doesn't work. Okay, so currently we don't, other than the clear example of this dopa-responsive dystonia, we don't know exactly what those subtle abnormalities mean in terms of dopamine. So the main find the evidence so far in terms of neurotransmitter abnormality is dopamine abnormalities in the brain. But in most other people, there is some subtle findings other people have reported, but in most people they don't respond. There's no obvious deficiency, like complete different, say, Parkinson's disease, that people will respond to dopamine. So the exact role of the transmitter is not entirely clear, but we think that dopamine has other functions. For example, have a function in mediating brain plasticity, how the brain changes. So we think that this could be part of that, but fortunately we don't have a very clear role for the rest of the other types of dystonia. Okay, so the question I think is on clinical brain SPECT scan. So SPECT is SPECT. So is it useful in diagnosis of dystonia, right? Okay, yeah. So I think maybe the type of scan you're referring to is something called a DAT scan, DAT. Okay, so DAT is a dopamine transporter scan. So this type of scan is actually, yes, available in the US and Europe, is not approved in Canada yet. It probably will be approved sometime next year. Now, this type of scan is mainly to diagnose a dopamine deficiency state, which is mainly Parkinson's disease. Okay, so I don't think it will be useful in the diagnosis of dystonia, other than if you want to exclude Parkinson's disease or some other disorder similar to Parkinson's disease, that would have a deficiency in this type of scan. Okay, but I think most people with dystonia would be normal in type of scan. So I don't think it would be that, even in Parkinson's disease, probably not that useful, because some of the issue we can discuss. But so it's really only used in very rare situations. But I don't think it will be widely useful in dystonia, because it cannot diagnose dystonia. It can mainly abnormal people with Parkinson's disease or related disorders, unless there's a question of this person has dystonia or Parkinson. But usually it's not that difficult to tell apart. Yeah. Your question is, does anxiety, etc., trick or make? Yeah. So anxiety, I think, or stress, for example, certainly make dystonia worse. I think that make tremor worse, make dystonia worse. We don't think this is the main. I mean, it's not the primary cause of the dystonia. We don't think the stress is the main cause of it. But having said that, anxiety, stress often will make it worse. I think it's very common. Yeah. So often is so exacerbation could definitely be related to that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, very good question. So the question is abnormal plasticity, what about retraining the brain, right? Yeah. I think yes. So there is bit of work. We have done some work in our own lab to try to retrain the brain in terms of normalizing the plasticity. So now most of the work in this has been done in the focal hand dystonia, the majority, like writer's cramp or musician's cramp. So there are some, we have tried some published studies. The question, the problem is that often takes a long time. It's a time-consuming thing to do. There are different protocols. We don't know exactly which type is best. So yes, but definitely a lot of interest, I think, in retraining the brain. I mean, I think it's an excellent idea. We as others have been pursuing it, and I think just more work needs to be done in terms of what is the best type of retraining. The other, maybe in the future, is, for example, we can use some sort of deep brain, but not magnetic brain stimulator to make the brain more, prime the brain, that maybe make the training more effective, for example. So yes, some work has been done, but I don't think there is, at this point, a completely recognized effective protocol as yet. So I think more work needs to be done to on this retraining aspect. But I think it's a very promising area. Yes. Right. So the question, where are the sense of excellence for dystonia, right? So I think so in North America there is the NIH, the National Institute of Health, is in Bethesda, Maryland. I think their work done in Emory, is in Atlanta, in Emory University. There's some work done at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. Now, in terms of surgery, like UCSF, University of San Francisco, has a quite active center. In terms of clinical work, Chicago, I think Rush University in Chicago do a bit of clinical work, and also the other is Columbia in New York. So I would say these are probably the bigger centers. I mean, now each one, many do clinical, many do research. Obviously, many they concentrate on different aspects of the research. I mean, there are also a number of European centers as well. That, for example, a group in Germany, in Hanover, is very active in the retraining aspect of particularly musicians' dystonia. Yeah. So the question, I think, is if release of adrenaline in the body will increase dystonia or tremor, right? Then reducing it will help. Yes, in a sense, yes. So that's, for example, that's why you have a tremor. Maybe this is maybe more applicable for people with tremor. Essential tremor, again, worsen with stress. Some people will take propranolol. I think the drug called propranolol is a beta blocker. So it's used for blood pressure. So it will actually, in a sense, is to antagonize effects of adrenaline. So beta blocker will reduce tremor in people with prone to, obvious. Then some people say when they give a talk, they have tremor, or they would take propranolol to do it. So in a sense, yes, there is that. Now, whether that works in people with dystonia, I'm not sure, because it's not, to be honest, it has not been our usual practice to try, say, propranolol. Because propranolol, it works because it's a adrenergic blocker, as you mentioned. So, but I think it only works in, certain situations. I mean, people who have this trauma will often use it as needed basis. Say when they have a stressful situation, say you want to give a presentation or something, they will take it for trauma. So it may work. Having said that, I mean, I would say, haven't been our practice to use it, but it's not I mean, it's conceivable, especially if someone who have dystonia or tremor that is particularly worsened by the stressful situation. That's a possibility. Of every drug, you have considered possible side effect as well. Yeah. So the question is, I think you have a secondary dystonia from a brain hemorrhage. Is that right? Yeah.
Basal ganglia thalamus squared.
Yes. Silver stroke. Yeah. Right. So that's correct. I mean, because of this is say some a stroke, some of the basal ganglia, there is no, I guess, intrinsic chemical abnormality. I mean, it's more a structural abnormality. I mean, it does affect the pathways. I think certain neurons will go through and they use certain chemicals like dopamine. But I think your main question is will this go away? Okay, now because I think now this type of dystonia usually, I know your experience, it doesn't happen right away after the stroke. Develop, few months or sometime maybe a year or two even after the stroke. Now I would say in most situations, this often remain kind of static in a sense. I think after, often you initially get worse and then you should become stable. So it's not likely to, it's not, because there's no degeneration. I mean, it's just a one-time event. So it's not likely to get worse and worse over time. On the other hand, I would have to say that we don't see a spontaneous recovery very often in this situation. I mean, it's not impossible. I mean, occasionally it happens, but I would say in most situations, this would become stable over time, but not much better or worse over the long term. But I don't think the dopamine drugs will work in this situation because it's more a structural problem. I mean, the dopamine cells themselves are still fine. It's probably just they're not getting to the area that they need to get to because it's damaged. So that in that situation, giving more dopamine is not going to work because the cells that needs dopamine is not working in the sense of rather than absence of dopamine. So I don't think there's any particular chemical neurochemical drug that would help in this situation. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So tremor is now we recognize is part of dystonia. So I've come to a new definition. Tremors include so many people with dystonia. So sometimes just neck is on one side. There's no tremor, but other cases there's quite a lot of tremor. So we think that the tremor is part of dystonia. We call it dystonic tremor. So we think the tremor is because to move a joint, whether it's the neck or the hand, the two group muscles, right? One muscle move one side, the other muscle move the other side. So the problem with tremor is that these muscles, both sides are contracting. Okay, and they are not in an organized manner. That's what causes the tremor. So people who've had tremor, so dystonia can definitely cause head tremor. Having said that, there are people who had tremor who do not have dystonia. For example, people with essential tremor or even Parkinson tremor can have head tremor. But dystonia is definitely one of the causes of head tremor. And we think that dystonia is because of excessive muscle contraction. And this is because, so when the tremor happens is that you need two sets of muscle. One set pull the head to the right, the other move to the left. So both sets are abnormally working. That's why when it causes the head tremor. And your second is the trick, right? The trick, yes, I think people who has the sensory trick and the tremor, often the trick might also help the tremor as well. So it's just actually one of the reasons why we think that people with dystonia, head tremor, the tremor is because of the dystonia. My colleague actually have done some studies. I don't know, Dr. Susan Fox, some of you may or may not know. So she has to use a drug which is a cannabinoid receptor. So it's not marijuana, but similar, work on a similar receptor. And actually, based on there's some basic studies that using the cannabinoid receptor drug could help. But unfortunately, I think in that particular study, it was in people with cervical dystonia. It doesn't work. So, so they have a basic group that take the drug, a group take a placebo, and there's no difference between the placebo and the group that take the drug. So there is some. Now I don't know of people actually using the marijuana itself. Okay, so to me, as far as I know, there are no good studies that have shown that it works. I mean, there is a rationale. That's why my colleague did that particular study. So I think there is a potential in that either the marijuana or some similar drugs that works on the cannabinoid, we call the cannabinoid system. But so far, I think that I have not aware of any basic possible high quality research that show that it's effective. But I think it's the potential. I think there's again something that should need further research on. Yeah. Treatment option of task-specific oral-mandibular dystonia, right? Yeah. Sorry? Tardive dystonia. Yeah. Okay. So, so tardive dystonia is, I guess, is because of use neuroleptic drugs. So, the treatment options, in general, anyway, for tardive dystonia, there is medications. I guess I have mentioned tetrabenazine or the other drug that now available in U.S. So tend to be more useful in tardive dystonia than other types of dystonia. And we have used botulinum toxin. Again, that depends on where the dystonia happening, whether the muscle involved is easily reachable with botulinum toxin. So people with cervical dystonia, for example, a tardive cervical dystonia usually actually respond quite well to botulinum toxin. So there's drugs, there's botulinum toxin. We have to have done surgery in people with severe tardive dystonia, or dyskinesia. But they are usually, I would say, more generalized. The people have quite a lot of movement in the arm or the leg. So who doesn't respond to other treatment, our group has done deep brain stimulation surgery for tardive dyskinesia. So I think still, the medication, mainly tetrabenazine, botulinum toxin, and in certain situations, surgery could be option.
It works for oral-mandibular.
Yeah, that I'm not 100% certain. I mean, that again depends. The situation is different. I would say then surgery is probably not as. I'm not sure anybody knows, to be honest with you, that oral mandibular task-specific dystonia. But for generalized tardive dystonia, that has been done. So the question could describe the deep brain stimulation surgery. So the target of the surgery is usually an area of the brain, in the basal ganglia, we call the internal globus pallidus. So typically what's done, so someone interested in deep brain stimulations first need to be referred. So we do have a team that specialize in seeing people who want or consider to have deep brain stimulation, because I mentioned certain type of dystonia respond better than other types. So people interested would first see a team of specialists specializing in surgical movement disorder like dystonia. Initially, by neurologists. So they will undergo assessment, will undergo brain MRI to look at the brain structures. Often undergo things like neuropsychological testing. But the procedure itself is typically implanted on both sides of the brain. It's separate, one side first and the other side the second time. Is typically awake surgery. Because the reason being that during the surgery, often the person is being tested. looking, say, move the arm, see how the ask to move, how to see how the neuron respond to try to accurately locate the target. If someone cannot be awake, it's possible to do it asleep as well. But if someone's able to be awake, I think usually done awake because there's certain things we need the person to respond. And after the surgery, I think I'll show you the picture. There's an electrode in the brain. There's a pacemaker type device called a pulse generator. Sometimes it's implanted the same day. Sometimes it's implanted a few days later. And then usually the programming, which is turned in similar on, start about a month after the surgery. The reason being that often because there is some swelling, for example, around the area of the electrode, we want to settle down first. And then there's a period called programming. So program done by neurologists. Basically, they turn the stimulus on and see which, the point of the DBS is that there are many combinations of stimulation parameters that can be used. So often it's like a trial and error process. You try this parameters, if it works, that's fine. If it's not working, you try another parameter. So often takes a few months, and especially in dystonia, because often the DBS doesn't work right away. Often take weeks to months to start working. So there's a period of programming that's involved to find the best combination of stimulation parameters to improve the dystonia. And I would say in dystonia, I mean, many people improve, but not 100%. Okay, so for some people it works, and also how much improvement also vary from person to person. But after some have a stable improvement, then usually they can stay on the same parameters. The pulse generator lasts currently probably roughly 5 years. So every 5 years you need to change. From refer to deep clinician to get the first appointment. Is that right? Okay. Now, I'm not the person that does it. So, no. So my knowledge is, I mean, right now is probably a few months, maybe 2 to 3 months. It's not not in years, but probably, I mean, I'm just guessing, probably roughly around 2 months or so, approximately. Mm-hmm. Yes. So the question, how to relieve the spasm, right, of the dystonia. Okay, your situation is from the stroke. So your question about the, I guess, device from like Dr. Ho, right? So, now that I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't have an answer because I have my feeling, to be honest, is that it's probably not going to be very effective because I mean, although I've not seen any, there are no studies that looked at that. The reason being that, I mean, there is the muscle spasm. So to relieve the muscle spasm, you need to relax the muscle. And I think that, as I can tell, Dr. Ho, it's stimulating the skin area. So, it may help to kind of improve pain, but I'm just doubtful that it will actually work on the muscle spasm itself. But things like, for example, botulinum toxin injection would relax the muscle. But the botulinum toxin injection is injected into the muscles that, because even though your arm is weak, but some muscles are weaker than others because that's why there's a posturing. So it will essentially try to relax the muscle that felt to be overactive. So yes, one of those side effects is weakness. So the the injection will have to be tailored to it all depends how much one inject. Right? I would say no. I don't think that usually is the case. Again, everybody is different. So people with dystonia, we often can identify the muscle that we think is too active, and usually it will relax the muscle. I mean, it doesn't work in everybody, but I think I would say the situation that you say the brain, okay, is relaxed, the brain just sends out more signal to tell the. I would say mostly it. I haven't seen a lot of that situation, but not to say that's impossible.